Hello everyone, welcome to Art Project 2020 Day 4. My name is Claudia and I'm working with the team at Ephemera. Today I'm going to introduce an amazing artist by the name of Louise Simpson. Louise Simpson is a Scottish digital and collage artist who rapidly ascended to widespread recognition in the tokenized art space through her work which explores the confusion, contradiction, and consumerism dominant in modern existence. In this talk, Louise presents her ink interventions, an ongoing project exploring the naturally generative qualities of Indian ink and the distinctive aesthetic this medium delivers once it's incorporated into her collage, photography, and digital artworks. So, without further ado, welcome Anna.
Hello, my name is Louise Simpson and I am a crypto artist from Scotland. During my talk today, I'm going to discuss my series of artworks exhibited in Art Project 2020, which I call my ink interventions. As part of this discussion, I'm going to focus on 4 areas. Firstly, I'm going to consider my journey with Indian ink as part of the story of my artistic career as an analogue artist. Secondly, I wish to look at my ink interventions in the context of the geography and history of the place that I call home, which is Scotland. I then wish to discuss the transition from analogue to being a full-time crypto artist and how I managed to include ink on this journey. Finally, I wish to explore the ink interventions themselves, analysing the generative nature of ink and the resulting abstraction of the figure. I have been an analogue artist for over 10 years, working mainly with collage, oil paint and Indian ink. My relationship with ink has changed dramatically over this time, and I would say this has been the medium which has both challenged and excited me the most. Indian ink's demands on the artist are wearing. It is hard to tame and mistakes are frequent. My journey with ink started with detailed works, both figurative and prescriptive, with very little room for expression. I think this is similar to the journey of a lot of artists. Indian ink doesn't leave much room for mistakes at this part of the journey, but despite many frustrations, I still loved it. I then moved to trying to merge my practice of ink and collage with varied results. It was at this stage that I started to enjoy the more naturalistic interactions of the ink with the underlying collage. This relaxation of form started to free up my practice. I had not really involved my computer in my artistic practice much until this point, apart from a limited use of Photoshop. So when I was invited by Known Origin, one of the crypto art platforms, to upload some of my collages onto their platform back in June 2019, I was interested to explore how I could make this transition to becoming a digital artist. It was clear that some of my early forays into Photoshop would now be put to the test. But it was more than that. I finally had an excuse to involve my beloved computer on this creative journey. As a result, more of my practice became digital, and soon I was uploading onto the blockchain regularly and actually selling crypto art. However, I couldn't contemplate making this massive leap from analogue art to crypto art without somehow taking Indian ink with me, and that is where my ink interventions come in. Before I discuss these artworks in more detail, I wish to focus on the second part of my talk, which is looking at my love of ink within the geographical and historical context of my home, Scotland. I was born near the Bathgate Hills, which host Cairnpapel, Scotland's Stonehenge. They are wild, mysterious hills, full of stories and shadows. I then moved to Edinburgh, a city that is beautiful, but similarly has a dark duality. Creating art requires a communion not only with your own subconscious, but that of the energy of the place around you. Edinburgh is full of hills and dark alleys. It is full of inky shadows. So the more that I began to be a full-time artist and create art every single day, the more my art started to include ink. It rains often in Edinburgh, and as it is a small city, I walk everywhere. Therefore, it's not unusual to get caught in a sudden downpour here. Was it the rivers of black ink with orange highlights running down the street that made an indelible impression on my subconscious? Did these black rivulets encourage me to develop my relationship with Indian ink? As the black rain poured down these ancient streets, I too started to let the black ink pour more readily, abstract pools and drips becoming more and more appealing. Historically, Scotland is home to many shadowy myths and legends. Storytelling is woven into our culture, from the spoken word through to fragments of tales passed down generations. As a Scottish artist, I believe there is a tethering to this tradition represented in many Scottish works of art. We love to tell a story. Art offers the option of the same story being told in a myriad of different ways. The viewer decides the ending. I feel that the abstraction offered by the ink in my works helps me to tell stories through my art, and that is completely in line with the Scottish tradition. Offer a hint of a story, and the imagination will do the rest. We also have quite a dark past in Scotland. Shadows are built into the fabric of our history. Edinburgh, in particular, represents a very clear duality of dark and light with its history. Birkenhead being the perfect example. The energy of Edinburgh is laden with its inky penumbra. I believe it is not possible to make artworks outwith the influence of such a duality. However, it is in these shadows that the really interesting things happen. Overpainting the ink in my artworks emphasises the colour in the shadows. Instead of ignoring the dark voids, the shadows are the main focus in these works, shouting loudly at the viewer. They are unable to be dismissed. I put part of the influence of that down to the historical context of the place where they were made. This joint geographical and historical influence may seem a little archaic given the technological advances that crypto art presents. However, I believe that my computer understands this slightly archaic influence to be my own human algorithm. It is a set of factors that make me the artist I am today. And in a strange way, my computer understands this. Making the leap from analogue art to crypto art was probably easier for me than a lot of traditional artists. I had been brought up playing computer games on some of the first PCs. Computers like the ZX81 and the Commodore were some of the first on the market, and I just couldn't get enough. Even though the games were pretty basic and it would take ages to load them, I fell in love with computers as a young teenager, and that love has never diminished. Therefore, it just seemed natural to start exploring the blockchain and tokenizing art. Here I was combining my two main passions, art and computers. At first, I tended to disassociate the actual making of the digital artwork from the ecosystem of crypto art. But with time, I came to realise that this very unique ecosystem was starting to influence my practice. I started to see computer-related analogies creeping into my artworks in a way that was subtle at first. The nomenclature of glitching and data corruption was starting to take form in some of my digital artworks, be it collage or ink works. I witnessed my practice starting to bend and evolve according to some of the much more technical aspects of this ecosystem. This certainly wasn't a conscious decision, but it's much more of a natural development. As an artist, as I strove unconsciously to expand my practice in this way, I started to revisit my journey with Indian ink. I had noticed that some of my happy mistakes were actually starting to look more and more like the corruption that I was searching for in my practice. They say that persistence is key with the command of any craft, and it is no different with making crypto art. Is the computer speaking to the art, or is the art trying to communicate with the computer? No longer was the conversation going on between the paper and the paintbrush, with the artist as the conduit. The whirring Apple Mac in the corner and I wanted in on the action. Throw into that mix the aforementioned influence of the ecosystem, and this is suddenly a very innovative breeding ground for the artist. And I guess that is what makes the transition from analogue art to crypto art slightly more complicated than it first appears. Accordingly, as I started to use Indian ink in this new abstract way in my crypto art practice, I found that its natural corruption was taking my crypto art in exactly the right direction. And this brings me to this body of work, the ink interventions themselves. As I started to involve more deliberate mistakes with the ink, I discovered that the ink's relationship with the underlying artwork was naturally generative. Generative art refers to art that in whole or part has been created with the use of an autonomous system. An autonomous system is one that is non-human and can independently determine features of an artwork that would otherwise require decisions made directly by the artist. Although generative art normally refers to algorithmic art, it can also be made using natural systems such as physics, chemistry and biology. As I poured rivers of black ink on digital paintings and photography in my studio, I started to see some strange and very beautiful results. The ink would naturally pool itself into puddles, some deep, some shallow, that over time would settle and sink into the paper. These natural stains left mysterious impressions on the underlying figurative artworks. They were abstract and full of expression, and completely naturally generative. I also experimented with various levels of viscosity of the ink, mixing it with water. These natural controls set by me as the artist produced even more results, all of which had various levels of abstraction. This is when I chose the term ink interventions, as these works involve both the natural generative intervention of the ink as well as my own natural controls on the ink. Some of the ink interventions are pure ink abstraction. Others are a combination of ink and oil paint. In the works where there's a combination of the two, I use oil paint in much the same way as the ink. It is used almost as overpaint, with the sole purpose of removing part of the figure underneath. This process allowed me to use both Indian ink and oil paint in my digital works. My inspiration for this deliberate abstraction of the figure is Gerard Richter. His series of overpainted photographs are incredible. He started painting over photographs in the 1980s. I love the mystery that the application of the paint gives to the figure underneath. Indeed, his overpainted photos were the perfect bridge between pure photography and abstract materiality. I applied the same concept to my ink interventions, using Indian ink as my main means of abstraction. I use it as a way of creating a void and interesting space in the composition. I want to create something that is essentially missing from the composition. Richter said this of his overpainted photos when asked how did he come up with the idea to paint these blurred photos. I was a student, and as such you generally rely on your prior models of how to make art, but these were not satisfying. Then I discovered in photos what had been missing in paintings, namely that they make a terrific variety of statements and have great substance. You can see in my ink interventions how the black ink void provides an abstract structure to support the oil paint. In all of the artworks, the underlying image is corrupted. We are missing essential information. We have no way of seeing the true nature of the figures underneath. Their faces are abstracted by this landscape of ink and paint. This corruption of the figure forces the viewer to look more closely. The abstraction lends both mystery and intrigue in perfect measure. These works represent not just a journey into a new digital landscape of crypto art, they also reveal my journey with this wonderful medium. I think it is incredible that Indian ink is able to evolve the vital part of corruption required as my crypto art practice develops. Thank you for listening.